No problem. So welcome once again, everyone, to the Brass Fall 2023 Online Symposium. This is our second session today. I'm Brian Garrison, Chair of the Symposia Committee. Thank you to our subcommittee members, Christy Cunningham, Doris Chewy, Christine Pollock, and Angel Truesdale. All sessions will be recorded and sent out to those who have registered. Please mute your audio and video as we get started. Thank you for spending time with Brass and our presenters today. And now I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Christy Cunningham, to get us started.
Okay, and I'll apologize for jumping the gun. So next we have Kendra Spahr and Clarissa Steele from Kansas State University. And they will be talking to us about the history for human resource management students, researching the experiences of people in protected classes prior to anti-discrimination laws. So Kendra and Clarissa, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Clarissa, are you going to run the slides or should I?
I can. I'll put them up right now.
Thank you.
Can everyone see that?
Yes.
So Kendra and I are going to talk about a project from my human resource management class that I teach every spring, and I've actually been teaching it this fall as well. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about the project and then how we were involved together in this project and then what the results were. And we're really interested in this because I'm going to be doing this project again for 2 sections of this class in the spring. So we're trying to improve the project and trying to get some resources from all of you who may have experiences that could help us make this project better. Kendra, I don't know if you want to do a little introduction about yourself, and then we can go on with the presentation just to talk about what your role is.
Yeah, so my name is Kendra Spahr, and I am a business and social sciences librarian at Kansas State University.
Excellent. So Kendra is the librarian for the College of Business, and I work in the management department. I am a professor of management, and I mainly teach human resource management classes. So let me just do a little introduction on the project that my students were doing, and then a little bit about like how I graded it, so that when we get into the resources that students used and how they use those resources, you'll have a better idea of what we're talking about. If at any point you have questions or comments that you want to make, you can put them in the chat. And then I think Kendra will be putting in a link to a Google Doc that we'll also have that we'll refer to during the presentation. We have a poll on the first question, which is at the end of this slide, actually. And then we're asking for your suggestions in that Google Doc for anyone who has some experiences or some resources. But we'll talk about it because we have several questions throughout the presentation. So we'll refer to that several times. So I'm sure we'll be putting the link in many times during this presentation. All right, so let's talk about this human resource management project that my students worked on. So the class that I teach in the spring is an introduction to human resource management. A lot of the students in this class are HR majors or are thinking about majoring in HR, but many are just management students who have to take it as part of their curriculum, their general management curriculum. All of these students haven't had an HR class in theory until they've come to this class. So they're just learning about human resource management for the first time. And one question I get a lot in that class is, we learn about all these anti-discrimination laws because that's the basis for a lot of the processes that we use in HR management. And students often wonder, what are protected classes? Because that's a huge part of what we do, especially because my area is diversity. So we talk a lot about what are protected classes, what are the laws around those, and then how do we make sure that we're following the law as we're developing our procedures and our policies within our organization. And one question I've gotten several semesters that I've taught this is, am I in a protected class? Or for some students, why am I not in a protected class? And actually all my students are in a protected class, but we have to talk about that at some point during the semester. And one thing I've realized is we just don't teach the history of employment discrimination at all in pretty much any business class. So they don't realize that a lot of the laws that we created to prevent discrimination in employment were because there were situations going on for many groups of individuals in the US that were hurting their chances of either getting a job or keeping a job or getting promoted within a job. And so that's what I wanted my students to learn in this project, was why we have these protected classes and what were the experiences of individuals who are protected now by anti-discrimination legislation. What were those experiences like before we had those laws? So the first question that we have, and I think Kendra's put the link in the chat on our Google Doc, was asking any of the business librarians here, if you are aware of DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion research assignments in business classes. We haven't found too many in the literature, so we were curious if anyone has some experiences with these kinds of assignments at all. And if you want to just, everyone who has a link should be able to get in that document. If you have any issues, just let us know in the chat. And then if you do have any experiences, can you just describe like what the assignment was just very briefly, or what it was that you were asked to do to get a sense of what kinds of experiences you all have? And then I'll give you like a minute or two. I'll be quiet so you all can type. And then if you have nothing to share, you can also just see what everyone else is sort of writing in that Google Doc.
So it looks like most of you are not aware of an assignment like this. We didn't put this in the question, but if you if you work with classes that are doing historical research in business classes, that might also be interesting for us to hear about. So it looks like people are still typing. Okay. So one person is mentioning that their colleagues present about researching a company's current DEI practices. That's an interesting research assignment. Oh, okay. The management communications course at someone's university has a team case study looking at supporting religious diversity in the workplace. I'm sure Clarissa and I would love to hear from whoever that is about that assignment and what they're doing. Excellent. Okay. So Clarissa, do you want to start with the overview of the assignment?
Sure, I'll let people keep typing. They're so interesting to read the kinds of assignments that people are working on. So I'll talk about this one a little bit more, and then Kendra will talk about the aspect, how the library's role in this and what we were hoping students would get out of working with the library on this assignment. So I was imagining that students would do something like a 15-minute presentation in groups, and they work in groups throughout the semester on a simulation. So I'm imagining that this was their first assignment together as a simulation group. So that was also helpful. They were getting to know each other through this assignment. And then they were all assigned a protected class. And a protected class, when we talk about that in HR, we don't mean a specific group. So a protected class would be an example would be like gender or race or religion. And then students would just pick one of those protected classes and then choose a group within that. So like if they picked gender, the gender groups usually picked women, but they could pick other groups as well, like trans individuals. They could pick men if they wanted. So they had their choices within the classes. I wanted to make sure all of them were covered though in class. So they all had very different groups that they were assigned to. And then we wanted them to look at the history of employment discrimination toward the group that they chose. So either we wanted specific examples of discrimination, like a specific historical event, or we wanted a description of the terms and conditions of employment. That's a very HRE term, but what were things that people were dealing with? For example, was it hard for them to find jobs? Were there certain industries they weren't allowed to work in? Were there times where people could be fired? For example, when women got pregnant in the past, they could be fired from their jobs. Those sorts of things. We wanted students to uncover some of those differences from the past, from now, to see what kinds of conditions people worked in. And really the skills I wanted them to learn were using resources, especially because a lot of them are going to have to make arguments when they're in a business towards something that they want, like leadership to change, or they have to talk about what's been happening in the past in their company. So these are just good skills to have generally, to be able to use sources and data to talk about that. And also I wanted some storytelling going on. What was happening? Tell us a story about what happened to these groups or specific events so that we could latch on to that a little bit more. And then just to show you kind of what I was looking for, not to say you need to study this presentation rubric much, I really wanted them to focus on that event and telling that story. That was the main part. And then I wanted them to connect it to what we were learning in class. So identify that class, that protected class, tell me the law that made that class protected under anti-discrimination legislation. I also wanted them to ensure that their presentation was professional. Sometimes in business classes, we require, for example, students to wear suits during presentations. I didn't require that, but I wanted them to use language that was appropriate and use PowerPoint slides that looked professional that you would maybe use in a workplace. So I will turn it over to Kendra to talk about her role and the other librarians' roles in this assignment, and then how we work together to help students research their groups.
So when Clarissa reached out to me about this project, my first thought was, this is really cool. I have been a business librarian for over 10 years now, and I hadn't worked with a class before that was doing a similar project, so I was really excited about it. But I also realized right away that I was going to need to learn some things in order to support these students effectively. And so I really didn't have a sense of what resources were available for history research. And I also was not confident in my ability to address topics and terminology with sensitivity and accuracy. So students might encounter language that is outdated or harmful in these historical resources. And so I partnered with a couple of librarians at my university. So our humanities librarian has a lot of experience with working with history classes. She's also passionate about primary resources and teaching with primary resources. I also invited a social sciences librarian who has an interest in accessibility and talking about disability in the workplace. And so we did a lot of preparation for this particular library instruction session. So we met with Clarissa a couple of times, first to kind of get her expectations for the project, what her ideas were, her expectations, and then so we came up after that meeting, came up with a list of resources that might work for this project. We shared that with Clarissa, and then we met with her again to kind of talk about those resources and then what the library instruction session might look like. So on the next slide, you will be able to see what sources we recommended. So we really emphasized primary sources. And so for those of you who aren't exactly sure what that is, I had to rely heavily on our humanities librarian to help me navigate this. So primary sources are primarily like accounts, artifacts, documents that are created contemporaneously with historical events. And so it could be things like historical newspapers, congressional documents, photographs, pamphlets, oral histories. And so in the library instruction session, we emphasized historical newspapers. So we have the historical New York Times at my university. So that was one source that we recommended to students. We also showed students the Digital Public Library of America. I did not know about this resource before our humanities librarian shared it with me, but it's really cool. It's like it's kind of like Google Scholar, but for digital archives. And so they aggregate metadata from a lot of different digital archives, including the Library of Congress. And so that was one resource that we talked about. We also showed students ProQuest Congressional, and that's because the project was based around workplace discrimination and legislation. And so we were thinking that there would probably be, congressional hearings, legislation where people might talk about their experiences with discrimination in the workplace or their constituents' experiences. So here on the next slide is an example of an individual source. So we gave students collections they could search on the research guide. We also pulled out some examples of primary sources that were relevant to different protected classes. I primarily wanted to do this because I needed practice searching for these resources. I wasn't sure what the students' experiences were going to be like. And so it helped me understand the amount of time and labor involved. It's kind of a laborious process, but also just in case students didn't find things on their protected class, they could look at examples, or they would have things that they could use in their presentation. So this was an example of one of the sources that I found. And so this was from the Jewish Telegraphic Agency archive. And so they had a daily news bulletin. And so this is an article from 1954 that talked about how 27% of Chicago firms bar Jews from employment. And so this was an example of a primary resource that really helped me sort of imagine what the experiences of people in that protected class might be when they're looking for work. And so this was, I thought, an interesting example. So now we would like you really quickly, again, to go back to the audience interaction document. I'll copy and paste it in here again. And so if you all would look at question number 2, and we know that you are librarians, and so you are all going to have excellent recommendations on sources that we could potentially use. So we would love it if you all went ahead and copied and pasted potential resources in this Google document. Nexus Uni. Negative news tab. I have not heard of that one before. We do not have Nexus Uni at my university. Yeah, legal cases. Yeah, that was one that Clarissa was talking about, because sometimes they will focus on individuals' experiences, right? Like there'll be a lot of background about that particular person and their case. Hein Online. Yes, we have Hein Online, and that was one that I didn't include. We didn't include, so we probably should include that in the future. Library of Congress.
I will say, as a professor, it's also helpful that all of you are also putting like what the information would be that you could pull from that source, because the students were using lots of different sources, and some of them they were using really well, but like I had many students who were downloading legal cases, and I can't read legal cases very well, like the actual like laws and then what was the interpretation of the courts. So having extra sources to help them make that interpretation or understand what was really going on in those cases is super useful.
Ooh, Smithsonian Archives. Oh, the American Hebrew. Okay. You all keep typing. And so I'll keep the presentation moving. So in the next slide, I talk a little bit about language and how we use language in the presentation. So in the library instruction session, in addition to talking about sources, we talked about historical language, and so how students might encounter outdated, possibly harmful language, and how even the language that is considered respectful changes over time, right? And one thing that we did was we included a content warning on our research guide, and our humanities librarian talked about that in the library presentation. And I will read our content warning. I was not familiar with what these were. They're very common, but I'll read it just for people who aren't familiar. A lot of archives have these now. And so ours is: these materials may include images and text reflecting various forms of oppression, including but not limited to offensive language or negative stereotypes. Instances of bigotry reflect the attitudes, perspectives, and beliefs of those that created and participated in them, and should be considered records of the era in which they were produced. So kind of contextualizing that this is the accurate historical record, but that this does not align with our current values. So giving students that context. We also talked about current preferred language in the library session. And so our social sciences librarian gave a presentation on person first language. So person first language as opposed to identity first language. is just an example of person-first language might be a person who has a vision impairment. And identity-first language might be a blind person. And so person-first language is preferred, but not by all individuals, right? And so she just sort of talked about the nuances of that. And we also provided students with style guides. An example would be the diversity style guide. These are created for journalists. There are many different style guides, but they can help students navigate using respectful and accurate language to refer to groups.
So here, I'm going to start with our lessons learned, but Kendra is going to, she has a lot of useful information to show what kinds of things students were presenting during their presentations and how they talked about the groups and the topics that they chose. So we have several issues going on with the presentations that we're trying to also improve for next semester. So one thing was a lot of their research was very superficial and not very in-depth. Like they would talk about, instead of a story of a specific incident, they would talk about generally like what the workplace was like, or for maybe not even one group, it could be lots of different groups, or just some general generic information, instead of giving us like a really, what is the day-to-day experience of that group. And then a lot of times, and this is where Kendra's going to show some very good examples, we didn't get a lot of context for the photographs and charts that they were including, so we weren't sure where they came from, and then what they were trying to say about the topic at that point in the presentation. And then a lot of the information also wasn't related to workplace experiences. They would talk more about for example, what the housing conditions were like, or education, which may be tangentially related to employment, but it wasn't about the conditions under which people were employed or seeking employment at that time. And then a lot of their information was loosely connected within the presentation, so it wasn't very cohesive. And I had told students before, well, I continually reminded them as well throughout the project that this would be on their test. Their very first test, and I was going to create a question for each presentation on the test for all of the for both classes. And I told students to take notes, which many did not, so that might have been one of the problems. But I think because of the loose structure, the incoherence of some of the stories that they were telling, students were trying to learn from each other, but I don't think they learned as much information as they could have if they had told like a very good story about the group that they were saying that people could latch onto while they were doing the presentation. And so I'm going to refer to anyone who has some resources for us that might be useful here. I'm going to refer back to that Google Doc that Kendra's been putting the URL in our chat for, to look at question 3. And one thing I'm going to delve into over winter break to improve this project is how do we teach students storytelling? And I've talked to, we have a sales group, a sales club, and we also have teachers who teach, instructors who teach sales techniques. And I asked them if they actually teach storytelling as part of their techniques. And a lot of them said they tangentially mention it, but they don't really delve into it. So right now I don't have a lot of storytelling resources, but if you have some resources on how to teach students how to storytell, that would be great. And I see you already are putting things in the chat, which is excellent, or in that Google Doc. This is really helpful because I'm going to be doing a rabbit hole dive over winter break. So I found some online courses as well where I could learn how to do the storytelling stuff and then look at how they present the information to maybe make some presentations. I might end up spending like a whole day in class on this and then giving students some examples of what this might look like for their presentations or for whatever they're going to end up making this semester. And then let me just show you, as people are working on the question 3, an example of a test question. I tried to give them easy test questions knowing that they weren't taking notes, and also they had 10 presentations to get through, so 9 and then their groups. So I tried to make very easy questions that they should know. So here's an example. So for one of the classes, this is the question. The test question was, based on the presentation about sex as a protected class, which of the following is an example of man-centered language? The group that presented in this class did talk about man-centered language. It was a slide that gave some examples, and then they talked about what that sounded like in the past. And so you can see a student who doesn't eat a good lunch may not do well on his exam would be what's considered man-centered language because of his. You're gendering the person in the example when the person doesn't need to be gendered. It's not a specific person. But you can see only 65% of my students answered that correctly. And honestly, this should have been an easy question for them, especially because we had a whole presentation from a librarian on appropriate language as well. So this should have supported that. And for anyone who's like interested in what Canvas does, we use Canvas as our learning portal. It also on the test questions will tell me for discrimination whether this is a good question, telling me who did well on the test and who didn't. And this actually was a decent question. Those who did well on test got this question correct, and those who didn't do well on the test didn't. So it could just be an issue of studying, but this was concerning for me because this is something, the kind of information I wanted them to take from the class. And then I'll give it back to you, Kendra.
Okay, so what we learned from the library instruction session. So we did an exit survey, and what we found is that students overall were positive about the class. That was kind of a relief to me because I was worried that students in a management class would not be receptive to something like this. But we even got comments like searching the Digital Public Library of America was fun. So that worked well. What we did find is that students were still had questions about terminology and were anxious about making mistakes. And I was like, completely relatable. I had the same thoughts when I was going to be working on this class. And so in the upcoming semester, when we do this, we are only going to address the historical language in the library session. The current language is something that I think Clarissa intends to maybe address a little bit more in depth later on, just because we didn't have time to really get into it too much in the library session. One thing that did work well is that I watched the presentations and I noticed that 2 or 3 groups actually used content warnings at the beginning of their presentation. So that was something that helped them contextualize what they were talking about. And so that's something that worked well. As far as use of resources in the presentation, students did include primary resources. As we said, they weren't required to. It was just something that we encouraged. Mostly they used photographs, but we found that we really needed to prompt them to include the context and how it contributed to their overall story. The other thing we noticed is that they did include secondary sources. So we didn't talk too much about secondary sources like statistics or scholarly articles in the library instruction session. I was surprised that they actually went out and found scholarly articles on their own, even though they didn't really get into depth in their presentations like we wanted them to. I think encouraging them to use those secondary sources that provide context and analysis is going to be important in the upcoming semester. So on the next slide, you will see an example of how students used resources. So one thing that they did is they included photographs without labels or context. And so these are a couple of examples from the presentation. So the first, the photograph on the top, students didn't explain what it was or why it was important to their presentation. And so I actually used a reverse Google image search, which we're going to tell students to do in next time we do this project to actually find this. And I found the photo, it accompanied an Atlantic article that labeled the photo, and it was of a group that I was not familiar with, a group called the New England Crusade for Religious Freedom. And so I tried to do some background research on that group. I did not really find much on them. What I did find was that they were mentioned in a Brown University archive that had a collection of dissenting and extremist printed propaganda. So I was like, I'm not sure if students actually understood what was happening in this photograph. And so this was an example of maybe not the best use of imagery. The second photograph was from a presentation on African American discrimination. And so again, the students, they just sort of used it as a decoration, right? And didn't really explain what was important about the photograph or what it showed. On the next slide, this is an example that students did that was a little bit better, I thought. So this group, their presentation was on gender discrimination. And on the previous slide, before showing this photo, they actually talked about the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the work that they did and what they were trying to accomplish. So they knew what the group was doing, how it related to workplace discrimination, and they labeled their photo and the source. And also they get extra points because it says this was probably taken in Kansas City, Missouri, which is local for us. So again, we need to encourage students to provide context and their sources. Students also use data in their presentations, and so we intend to focus a little bit more on how they can use data more effectively. So this was an example from the presentation on national origin discrimination. And so this was okay. It's just that the image is not easy if you are looking at a presentation and the slides are going by kind of quickly. It's not easy to interpret it and the variables aren't labeled. And I'm not sure if the students really talked about how this connected to their topic. On the next slide, we have an example that I thought was effective. I specifically remember it from the class. So this was on the wage gap between Black and white men. They used historical data from a scholarly article. This presentation is much more simple. It's easier to read. I also liked the students actually added in this ratio part. So that was not in the original article. So I was like, oh, extra points for them. They made this data easier for us to interpret. So those are things we intend to focus on a little bit in the upcoming sessions. And we would love it if on our Google Doc, you all have like information literacy instruction tips that we could include in our upcoming session. So those were the ones that kind of stood out to me. And so that is question 4. We would love to hear your information literacy related tips for a project like this. And I love that people are still working on the storytelling slide. This is great. We need that. Yeah, tracing the citation back to its original source.
Kendra, I don't know if we want to address a couple of questions that we've already gotten in the chats. And I can read them out loud for you as well. So the first one was, how much time did you expect students to devote to the historical research? Digging to gather enough information and details to tell a story is very time consuming. Are you really focused on teaching them those skills? And I know we had the library day where they started researching, and I actually gave them 2 or 3 more days in class where they worked together. I learned from the pandemic not to make them do group work outside of class. So they had several days to work in class over a month period of time. So I know, I'm not sure if that was enough time for them, but they did have some time to work on this. And the very first time they had to work was in the library session. And I'm going to ask the next question because it might, Kendra, be related to how you would answer that question. So it said, can you share more details about what the library instruction session looked like? For example, did all 3 librarians present? And so if so, how did you divvy up who talked about what and for how long? And how long was the full instruction session?
Yes, so for the instruction session, it was 75 minutes. All the librarians spoke. I spoke about historical newspapers. Then our social sciences librarian gave it the quick presentation about 5 minutes on preferred language. And then our humanities librarian did the majority of the presenting. She actually took a couple of examples of primary resources and had students kind of talk through what they were seeing, how to think about those resources. And so they did not tend to go into that kind of depth in their presentations. They had more breadth. And I think that it might be better to encourage them to maybe focus on 1 or 2 sources, right? And sort of go into a little bit more depth onto their topics. And so let's see. And then we had time at the end, gosh, I'm going to say probably like 15 minutes where students actually had a chance to start working in their groups. And that's when we walked around and talked to them about their projects. So that was the full instruction session.
And we actually, the next class session after that, they continued to work on the research they had started at the library session. So the librarians were no longer there, but I was there to help them kind of pick something for their presentation and start working on that specific topic. And then I see another question. As a new BizRef librarian with a background in special collections archives, I'm curious, are MBA students particularly unfamiliar or unused to citing sources and are using primary sources? So I did not mention this. I only teach undergraduates. So these were undergraduate students, and a lot of them are sophomores or juniors. So they haven't yet had their data analytics classes. They haven't had statistics. They probably have had a few business writing classes, but those are not taught in our department. So I'm very sure they don't have to do a whole lot of citing yet. And a lot of times what they do cite are often like data for businesses that they found online, not necessarily at the library. I don't know, Kendra, if you have more experience with students generally, that you could address that question a little bit better.
Yeah, well, I guess it's my sense that at least business instructors aren't, like, they will often ask me to address, like, how can they find high quality sources, like, but then maybe there's not a lot of reinforcement of that. And so students might not do much more than copy and paste a link as a citation with the title of the resource. And so that's something I would like for business students to be better at, but it's not always a skill that's reinforced as much as maybe market or industry research.
Yes. And I was going to say, as a professor that does research, we've had this complaint in our college that even our MBA students can't help us with research because they don't know how to use the library to find sources and then even to do citations to put a reference list together. So I can very much agree with some of those comments, even as a professor. So let's talk about how we're going to change the assignment into the future, because we have one more question, but then we can open it up for even more questions and answers as well. So we're going to work on this for the spring semester. I have 2 sections again. They're both undergraduate sections of the same class. I really want to emphasize the storytelling and framing. I think that will help, and especially when we have them just picking one topic or one source or a couple sources to really focus on for that story. And then I want them to create notes pages for other students about their topic for when they're presenting. And they may or may not be doing presentations. I'm going to let them have some choices in how they present the information. So they can make a video, they can make a podcast, they could do lots of different things. But provide a note sheet for students to follow your presentation and fill it in while they're watching the presentation or listening to the podcast. That might help other students to not only take notes, but to keep up and listen to what you're saying so that they can get that information. And that might actually be an included part of, like, that's how I know that you went through the information for other students' presentations in the class. More specific topic suggestions, and actually I will say the Google Doc may actually help us create some specific suggestions for students for their different groups, because we actually had created a resource from the library with some links, but to get them started. But I think you all will have some extra information that we could include, and even more incidents or more specific historical events that we could have them talk about more specifically. And then I want to separate, as Kendra had mentioned, the historical language, which they'll need at the beginning to start searching for their topic. And then later, maybe talk more about how we currently talk about those groups before they start making whatever it is that they're going to make, like their podcast or their video or whatever, so that they can separate out those 2 things, but also so we can have a more in-depth conversation about what are current practices that we use in business and talking about these different groups, and how do you do that thoughtfully without saying something wrong, or what happens when you do say something wrong? How do you fix that? Because it's going to happen for many of us in the business situation outside of the classroom, and I want them to learn those skills. So the final Google Doc question we have for you, and I see you all still filling out question 4. Awesome, thank you. Is the 5th question on if you have any thoughts or ideas on how to improve this project. And I have a feeling many of you do, and I can see in the chat we probably already have some comments and questions that will relate to that as well. But we would be very thankful if you all had some suggestions and different ways of thinking about this project when you're not kind of in it like we are right now. And I'm going to move on to the next slide while you all write in question 5 if you have something to suggest, so that we can oh, that was the last slide, sorry, so that we can have more Q&A and open this up, because I have a feeling a few of you will still have questions, and maybe we even want to talk about some of the suggestions you're making. So I'm going to open up the chat. I don't know, Kendra, if you've been watching, if
I have been watching it. I think we have answered all the questions. Let's see. Okay.
I see one that was this a one shot, meaning they did just one presentation, I'm guessing.
So one shot is like a one-time library instruction session.
Yes, yeah. And
That's
maybe, I mean, that's something Kendra and I have to talk about if we want more than that, because I also don't want to pull too much on the resources of the library for one student's project in a class. But if that's helpful for students, that might be a good way to do this. Another thing I'm going to do, I didn't mention this in this last slide, is we started, I think it was the second week of class even, where we had the library session. They hadn't even gotten to the chapter in class yet that talked about these anti-discrimination laws and protected classes. So I remember the next week I had to fill them in on what this was before we got to that chapter. And so this time we're going to delay this project until further on in the semester after they've learned about these laws, to say, hey, now we're going to do this project to supplement the information you've already learned to get a better sense of why we have these laws. And I think that will also help them to better research these ideas and also understand why we're learning this more than me starting at the beginning of the semester with, we're going to learn about this stuff, but you haven't gotten to the chapter yet where we actually learn these laws. Any other like questions or comments? I see people writing in the Google Doc, so.
Yes, thank you so much. We are going to be excited to go back and look at all of this. I think getting students to have those storytelling skills is going to be the most difficult. I think that's really valuable. And as Clarissa and I have talked about, those are skills that we as professionals are still learning. So I'm excited to know more about that.
Yes, I like the backwards design. We did a little bit of that this time where we had the presentation. We broke down the assignment. I didn't show you all of it, but they had little assignments throughout every week that they had to get done to get their presentation ready. But I think we will have to do more of that. And yet that's another skill that they can learn from this class then that they can take elsewhere. And definitely in the business world, because a lot of them are going to be working on big group projects or consulting where they're going to have to be able to break down projects into smaller parts that they can work on. And then interestingly, I don't know if this is interesting to anyone else, our MBA students don't take an HR class. So I will not be teaching this for the foreseeable future to MBA students, but I think they should learn this. And I agree. I think this would be very helpful for them to learn these research skills as well.
And I'll say thanks, Victoria. I was super excited about this project as well. So
I also enjoyed, I think Kendra, you did too. I enjoyed watching the presentations. I learned a lot from them because this is not my area of research. Like I research diversity, but I don't know the history of all of the groups that the students presented on. So it was really just fun to learn a lot as well from our students.
yeah, I think for me, I think Clarissa has been conscious about taking up too much of librarians' time, but for me, this is I'm willing to put in a lot of work if I can learn from the project. So yeah. So it looks like we do not have any more questions. So I will just say thank you all for your time and your sources, and it has been lovely.
Yes, thank you so much. This will be very helpful for us, and we really appreciate all the feedback.
Well, I want to say thank you to both Kendra and Clarissa. This has been great. I work a lot with our HR faculty members, so I might suggest something like this or some kind of knockoff of this because I think this would be very helpful to all of our students. I think we have a 15-minute break coming up at the top of the hour. We have our last